Welcome everyone to one of Volkswagen's most important products with this, the 2020 Volkswagen Tiguan. And it is one of the brand's most important products because it fights in the highly competitive small SUV segment. And we're gonna check it out. I'm gonna give you a full tour of it, but first I wanna make sure you guys like the video and subscribe to the channel. Welcome everybody to the 2020 Volkswagen Tiguan. And before we start, we have to talk about how this SUV actually comes about. Because as you'll know, manufacturers don't want to spend big money developing individual platforms for each model. As a result, Volkswagen decided to create what's known as the MQB platform, which is essentially a modular platform which underpins from the Golf hatchback all the way to that large Atlas we tested a couple of weeks ago. And the result is that not only does it keep costs down in terms of production, it also means that a lot of Volkswagen cars typically tend to drive kind of similarly. And I say that in a positive light because from the Golf that drives excellently, the Atlas is pretty compelling, and the Tiguan is fairly nice as well. But more on this specific Tiguan, because this Tiguan has a 4-cylinder turbocharged engine under its hood developing around 180 horsepower. And if the platform sharing isn't enough, this 2-liter engine is found all throughout the range. In fact, it's the same 2-liter you find in the larger Atlas, although it's slightly detuned in this application. Unlike some of Volkswagen's other offerings, which give you a dual clutch automatic transmission, this one is a traditional 8-speed automatic, and there's really nothing fancy to it. But in this sense, it actually works better because it's a little softer, a little smoother than a sort of quick shifting dual clutch and the sort of potential drawbacks that could bring. In terms of power delivery, it's actually pretty decent. I know that some of these Volkswagen engines have a bit of turbo lag before they get going, and the Tiguan is no stranger to that. It actually takes a little bit of while, even when you're at speed, when you put your foot down to the point where you actually get moving at a decent pace. But thankfully, the Tiguan actually does a good job of giving you a good amount of pace once you're actually boosted up. Now, it's not fast by any means, but in terms of some of its competitors, it does feel a little bit more punchy. That's largely due to the fact that most of the torque this engine produces comes in very, very low in the RPM range, meaning that it's very useful specifically in situations like what I'm driving in currently. Some morning commuting and kind of traffic situations, it's pretty good. Like I mentioned earlier, the automatic transmission is quite smooth, and as a result, there's really not much to comment on it. In terms of city driving, it's pretty much unnoticeable. In comparison with other competitors, I much more prefer a regular automatic over a CVT, largely because this automatic seems to do a better job of managing the actual power that the engine develops and making the Tiguan feel about as fast as it should, because a CVT could really kill your engine, especially if it doesn't know how to keep that engine in the right power balance and make your car feel quite slow despite it having a decent horsepower figure. In terms of small SUVs, the Volkswagen Tiguan is one of my favorites to drive, largely because of that platform, but mainly because it feels kind of like an oversized hatchback than it does a sort of SUV, which I think is a good thing. The Volkswagen Atlas we reviewed a couple of weeks ago feels quite large, and as a result, even though it has the same platform, it doesn't really offer the same level of driving dynamics. This Tiguan, though, is actually pretty good. I would say it's planted. It actually does a good job of sort of keeping itself in check even when the going gets a little bit twisty, but it by no means is it sporty. But in terms of small SUVs, this is one of my favorites to drive. So let's quickly talk about styling, because the same way I wasn't a huge fan of the larger Atlas, I don't exactly love the Tiguan much either. And that largely has to do with, I feel like the design is a bit confused. I feel like it kind of wants to look boxy, but at the same time is trying to be sleek, and it doesn't really commit to either or. And as a result, I feel like it looks a little odd. And above all else, the biggest fault, it looks a little boring. Thankfully, Volkswagen does offer some spiced up versions of the Tiguan, like for example the R-Line. Now you have to keep in mind that those higher trim levels come at a much higher price. I still think the standard Tiguan is the one to go for, because the thing is that if you love Volkswagen's aesthetics, you're going to get the same look throughout the entire range, because all the cars kind of look very similar. So if you're a fan of the styling, then the Tiguan is perfect because it drives well and then it would look good in your opinion. But for me, I still feel like they could spice up the design a little bit more and make it look a little bit more dynamic, especially considering the segment in which it participates in, which is highly competitive. Take for example the fact that this competes with the Toyota RAV4, which offers a couple of different trim levels with different looks. Granted, that is also quite expensive, but Toyota manages to sell over 400,000 of those in 2019 alone. So there's definitely a market there for Volkswagen, and if they get the styling just right, they might be able to get a good share of it. One thing that I think Volkswagen actually got pretty right is the interior, because although you're clearly surrounded by plastic pretty much everywhere, Volkswagen does a good job of hiding it. There's a little bit of chrome right around the dashboard. Some of this plastic is actually glossy versus some of it that's sort of matte, and as a result, the sort of varying looks and textures and finishes make it look a little bit more dynamic than just plain old plastic, which I think is a win in my book. Now, the layout itself is extremely simple, and I really like that. The screen is nice and large, and as you can see, it's very easy to reach and very easy to operate. Right now, I've got Apple CarPlay plugged in, and something that some other screens don't really get right is that this one is very high resolution, has very vibrant colors, and I really dig that. One added benefit of having a decently sized screen close to you is the fact that you don't have to have a rotary controller or a touchpad controller or nothing. Everything is controlled by these touch sensitive sort of buttons on the side, 2 knobs, and then you have everything going on in the screen. I prefer it this way because that way you're not trying to fiddle with anything down here. You can kind of select what you're looking for, and above all else, you can make your selections very quickly, which means you're distracted less time than if you had to sort of fiddle with things and kind of really make sure you click the selection that you want. However, the biggest plus for me personally is the digital instrument cluster. Nothing makes a car feel more modern for less money than a digital instrument cluster. If you're between a Tiguan that has the standard analog gauges or this digital cluster, opt for the digital cluster, because not only does it look nice, it'll actually make the Tiguan feel like a much newer car. Now, the screen itself is also very high quality, and above all else, the colors match with the sort of center screen. So it's not like you have an LED or OLED screen in the middle and then you have a sort of LCD lower quality screen over here. No, the quality is consistent in both, and I think they match up quite nicely. It definitely looks like it's meant to be there, not just sort of like an optional extra that was kind of an afterthought. Like most digital displays, it's very configurable, so you can choose whether you want a speedometer, you can want pretty much any information, and the fact that they're digital means that the display itself can give you extra information inside of the dials themselves, which means that you can make better use of the actual screen real estate you have available. This interior is quite comfortable as well. Now, just by looking at the seats, they don't look like the most comfortable thing in the world. They look very flat. That was my first impression of them, but after driving it for a while, I think they're pretty comfortable. I mean, I have no problems with it. They're actually been quite a sort of surprise in the overall Tiguan. I got pretty comfortable with them immediately. They're nicely adjustable, power adjustable, and I was able to find my perfect seating position without any issue at all. Now, although I like the interior for the most part, there is one major letdown, and for me, that is the interior quality. Now, an interior can be cheap, but it can feel much nicer as long as you get the overall contact points right. And this is a point where I think the Tiguan kind of fails, because if we look at the steering wheel, even though it does look like it is leather wrapped, it feels very cheap and flimsy. Now, if we look over to the gauge selector, yep, plastic. And if we look over to the door handle, plastic. And as a result is everything you sort of interact and touch is like hard plastic. And that gives the Tiguan an overall cheap feeling interior. Despite the layout being nice, despite some of the components being high quality, the actual material of the leather, of the plastic, it feels kind of cheap. And worst of all is that you can kind of hear the plastic creaking when you touch it, especially the door handle. You can definitely feel it. If you go to grab it, you can feel it sort of flex and crickle, and that's kind of not what you'd expect from a quality product. And I feel like just nailing those contact points would severely improve the feeling of quality, even though it remains largely the same. The exact Tiguan we're driving is the SEL, which has an as-tested price of about $32,000. Now, keep in mind that the Tiguan does start at the mid-20s, so if you want a sort of bare bones Tiguan, there's absolutely also the option to go that route. But my personal recommendation after driving cars with the analog cluster and sort of lacking some of the nice touches and looks that this one has, I would say if you're gonna grab the Tiguan, make sure you grab a high spec one, because it makes all of the difference. So there we have it. The 2020 Volkswagen Tiguan is the brand's small SUV contender. And while it does drive very nice and have a nice interior layout, its looks leave a little bit left to be desired, and overall interior quality is not the best. However, in terms of its competitors, I would say it's right smack in the middle. And if you do want to get a Tiguan, make sure you get one with all the nice little tech features, because it does elevate things substantially. And with that, I want to make sure you guys like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again very soon.